Okay, thanks for waiting, everyone. We had the wrong stream key for a moment. Good to go now. We're going to go ahead and begin the live stream. So, as a preface, we're not talking about Bitcoin. Go away. So last Monday, we talked about classic cryptography. We talked about what it is and kind of what it'll do for us. But obviously, it's not really going to cut it in this day and age. We have very complex systems, we have very sensitive data, and we have a lot of processing power. So before we try to figure out what we're going to use and what we're going to do, should probably kind of stop and think, what is encryption? What is it doing for us? So at its core, all that encryption does is take a piece of plain text. So it could be, text, it could be an image, it could be a video, something that is meaningful. And it produces a ciphertext, something that appears meaningless, something that looks random, that looks unreadable, and ideally leaks no information. And to go between them, all you need is a key. And that key is something that is, secret. Now, there's two major types of encryption algorithm. You have symmetric cryptography, where you have a single key that goes both ways, and you have asymmetric cryptography, which has got two separate keys, and they're not interchangeable. You can't go from one key to the other. So asymmetric cryptography is extraordinarily important. It's why you're able to securely connect to websites and send messages to people that only they can read, and so forth. But we're going to start today with symmetric cryptography, because, to be honest, it's a lot less cursed. It's a lot simpler in a lot of ways. And we'll actually be kind of getting into some heavier math next week to talk about asymmetric crypto, so you have that to look forward to next week. So in the symmetric cryptography space, there's two big kinds of ciphers. You have stream ciphers. They work on one symbol at a time, and you have block ciphers, which don't. They need fixed size chunks of data. So the Visionaire cipher, which we talked about on Monday, is actually a stream cipher. It takes any length of input, and it takes your key and just duplicates it over and over again, and it produces a ciphertext. So you notice that we didn't have to have an input of length 16 or multiple of 8 or whatever. We just had whatever length we wanted. Now, obviously, that isn't going to cut it. But something that's at least a little bit more advanced than that is the linear feedback shift register cipher, or LFSR for short. If you've ever messed around in Homebrew or making illegal copies of DVDs, I don't know, I won't judge you. You've probably heard of this, because it's basically a very simple way to generate a long string of random data. So, as the name implies, it basically just takes some feedback from this queue we have and combines it together in some way and puts it back on the queue. So in this case, it's combining together bits 11, 13, 14, and 16. And whatever the XOR of that is, I believe, it just comes back here and gets shoved onto the head of the queue. So these are very simple to build. If you Google it, you'll find people building them out of just random electronics kits, LEDs for the slots in the queue and that kind of thing. And it's the math behind it powers things like cyclic redundancy checks, so CRCs, that way to check for errors in transmission, as well as things like DRM on DVDs. I believe it's something scrambler, content scrambler. I don't remember the name, but it was a relatively weak crypto system that would encrypt data on DVDs and decrypt it as you pulled it off. But there is a big problem here. As the name implies, LFSRs are linear, which I don't want to get too far into the math here, because cryptanalysis is its own multi-part series to even break into, really. But basically it means that combining together different inputs to a function is the same as summing the function applied to those different inputs. And this makes it a lot easier to reason about how the system behaves. It's kind of like how no matter how many matrices you have, you multiply them all together, you get one matrix. Same kind of idea. So this makes it pretty easy to break using something called a known plaintext attack. If I can get a bunch of known data and a bunch of ciphertext, I can figure out what the key was. I mentioned that name, known plaintext attack. You might not have heard of that before. So there's a couple of kind of big, broad, theoretical ways to attack a cryptosystem. And a good system needs to resist as many of these as possible. So the most trivial is ciphertext only, where you only have the encrypted text. So, for example, if I gave you this blob of text and I told you to figure it out, nothing else, it's all you have. That's doable with things like Caesar ciphers and even Visionaire ciphers for longer amounts of text, using frequency analysis and so forth. But this is typically the kind of territory of brute forcing, where ideally you just have to guess. Now, chosen plaintext is a little weirder. It means that as the attacker, I'm allowed to get pick some plaintext and have them encrypted. And that might sound kind of weird, and it might sound even weirder as chosen ciphertext, where the attacker can pick ciphertext and then request decryptions of them. So you might think that doesn't make any sense. If the attacker can decrypt the data, they've already won. They broke it. It's over. But that's not necessarily true. For example, you might have a system where there's one entity, they have the secret key, and they're doing encryption and decryption for lots of people. If I can find the key exclusively by getting them to decrypt stuff for me, then suddenly I'll be able to recover that key and break the system. So cryptosystems need to be very resilient. They need to avoid leaking information in a wide variety of situations. It shouldn't be possible to just break the key by just guessing all the combinations. The Caesar cipher has exactly 26 of them, and it is not secure, obviously. The ciphertext shouldn't leak data, and this is something interesting that with asymmetric cryptography, where that gets a lot more difficult to avoid. Fortunately, as from what I've seen, symmetric cryptography is generally safer, easier. It's not easy, but it is easier. So those are just some of the kind of broad metrics we use to decide, is this cryptosystem safe? Let's see here. So we mentioned there was two kinds of ciphers, and this is the other one. So block ciphers. They have a fixed input-output size, for example, 128 bits or 16 bytes. So if you want to encrypt more than 16 bytes at once, you have to actually break it up. And you also have to pad blocks to make them fit evenly. So for example here, this is 64-bit blocks, and you see we have 8 A's, 8 B's, 8 C's, and 8 D's. Now if I only want to have 5 D's on the end of this, I need to pad it. And so we have to insert 3 symbols of padding onto there. And so in this case, it might look like that. That'll be very important in a couple minutes here. So some kind of well-known kinds of block ciphers, you've probably heard of this one, DES, the Data Encryption Standard. It is a 64-bit cipher, so you can't enumerate all the keys easily, but it's still kind of small. And there's actually only 56 bits of secret. There's 8 bits of parity, or basically error checking. And thanks to differential cryptanalysis, which will be touched upon in a minute, it's possible to brute force it a little faster than that. So when we say that this cipher is deprecated, broken, bad, it's not like you can just, in 10 seconds, break the cipher. It's not Caesar's cipher here. It does mean that we've found ways to attack it that are better than just brute forcing, and that's usually kind of the death knell for a cipher. Because once that happens, it kind of implies there's foundational problems, and it's going to need to be replaced. Now, DES is a Feistel cipher. I think that's the right pronunciation. And it's basically a strategy for making block ciphers, and it's pretty straightforward. You just take half of your input, you transform it somehow, and you smash it together with the other half of your input. You swap them, and you keep repeating. The really nice thing about this is that the only difference between encryption and decryption is the order in which you put these secrets in, like K0, K1, Kn. Notice decryption, all we did was we took the result and we flipped the keys around. So it winds up making this very nice invertible system that doesn't require the function itself to be invertible. And this makes it very easy to create a good cipher. And there's, of course, an XKCD comic that relates to it. Number 153, if you'd like to have a look at that yourself. So as I said, DES is considered broken. We can attack it more quickly than brute forcing. That does not mean we can attack it quickly, just more quickly. And differential cryptanalysis is, again, kind of a whole talk into itself, but I'll just give you the 1-minute version here. It means that due to the way the cipher is designed, if I have two inputs that differ in some way, it has a predictable impact on the resulting ciphertexts, and that's bad. We want a cipher to have absolutely no apparent correlation between input and output. So if DES does this, then it means that we're leaking information, and that will help us to recover the key with lots and lots of plaintext ciphertext pairs. Remember, this isn't cheap, this isn't easy. It's just easier. So DES is deprecated. Triple DES is also just not used anymore. And in its place, we have AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. It's got 128-bit keys, or 192, 256, take your pick. And the block size is, 128 bits. And there are no known efficient attacks on AES. Differential cryptanalysis in AES is it technically works, but it's so pitiful that it's basically no better than just guessing randomly. And the source of those attacks comes from the kind of tool we use to avoid another problem we mentioned, linearity. So without adding some kind of non-linear component to your cipher, something that you can't just kind of say fxy equals fx plus fy, you're going to wind up with a really bad cipher. So to get around this, we have the Sbox, or the substitution box. And all it does is permute your data. So I think this is one of AES's Sboxes. It has 16 in total. You just kind of take you got 1 byte of input, and it spits out 1 byte of output. And there's ideally no pattern to this. It's just all over the place. And so this is very nonlinear. So AES does have a lot of steps in it. Like, it mixes stuff, it flips, it does all that stuff in the XKCD comic. But the Sboxes is what makes it nonlinear and what makes it actually strong. So if you didn't have those, you'd be in deep trouble. And if you make even a slight mistake when designing it, you can be in deep trouble. So as I mentioned, DES, it kind of has this predictable correlation between input and output. That's because its Sboxes are kind of uneven. So there's some outcomes are more likely than other outcomes. Now, this does raise questions when you have a 3-letter agency responsible for designing those Sboxes, and people get a little bit suspicious, you might think. And there was some controversy surrounding DES's Sboxes, for example. People thinking maybe they're backdoored, because if you just have a little error in it, it can leak enough information to break the system. Now, block ciphers are cool, but I mentioned that we need to have these fixed sizes, like 8 bytes, 16 bytes, what have you. So what if I want to encrypt larger plaintexts? I would like to encrypt my entire hard drive, for example. Well, that's where the block cipher mode comes in. It's basically a thing you plug a block cipher into to make a usable system. So it doesn't really care what the cipher is. It just cares that we have a cipher. So we could actually implement all of these things we're going to talk about here with the Caesar cipher if we wanted to. You shouldn't, but you could. So the most basic is the electronic codebook method. And as the name kind of suggests, it's basically just a big lookup table. So if my input is all A's, it'll map that to one thing and one thing every time. It's predictable, it's easy, we can decrypt anywhere we want very easily, but it's not very good. So because there's no correlation between blocks, that means that this is incredibly malleable. We can just delete blocks, we can insert blocks, we can do whatever we want. Even if we don't know what the blocks contain, we can still mess with them. And as you can see here, if we encrypt this picture of a penguin, we get something that looks a lot like a penguin. So even though each individual block is very well secured, broader patterns are revealed. And I wonder if you looked at Fair Game Crypto 300, there might be something relevant there. I don't know. This could be. So, the first scheme you kind of think of that actually avoids this is cipher block chaining. And as the name kind of implies, it basically means that we take the ciphertext of each step and smash it together with the next step's plaintext before we encrypt it. So now every block depends on the block that came before. And if I get rid of a block, if I mess with the block, everything else goes haywire. Or at least the next block goes haywire. And there's one kind of special thing here, because you see, like, block 3 uses block 2, and block 2 uses block 1. What does block 1 use? It uses an initialization vector, it's basically just, an input, which you should not reveal, which will be used to combine with the first plaintext. And decryption proceeds similarly. We actually can do this in parallel because we have all the ciphertext available. It's not like we have to wait for this to decrypt the next block, and so forth. So it's pretty efficient. So, this has some big problems. So I mentioned the word malleable earlier, and it's about to come up a lot more here. So if I have 2 blocks, and I poke a single bit in one block, the next block will change. And importantly, it'll change predictably. So let's say here I just poked this bit, and now it's being changed. Well, the decryption is going to go completely nuts, because, again, the cipher should have no correlation between input and output. So a slight change in the input will have kind of an avalanche effect and change the entire output. But we do have a predictable impact on the next plaintext, because one bit here is getting XORed with one bit there and changing just one bit. So this can cause complete cryptographic doom. So, remember I mentioned that blocks are padded. They have to be made to be 16 bytes long or whatever. So, a very popular way to do that is specified by PKCS5, which is a standard for cryptosystems. And it basically says, if you need to pad n bytes, you just add that value that many times. So, for example, this is valid because there's 1 byte of padding. This is valid, there's 2. And because this one is flush and lined up, we have to add an entire block of padding. We couldn't just leave this off, because then we wouldn't know what the padding, we wouldn't know how much padding there is. So this is cool. We don't have to include the length, and there's no ambiguity. It's all good. But again, complete cryptographic doom. So when we decrypt, we obviously should reject invalid padding, because that data is clearly corrupted. No, you could not have produced things like A, B, C, D, F, G, 2 correctly. You could not have produced 1, 2, or you could produce something with no padding. All of these are bogus, and they should be rejected. But the attacker, remember, can very precisely manipulate this last block. And this is where things go horribly wrong. So we can tweak the second to last block until we know there's a 1 at the end of the final bit of plaintext. Then we know we found a bit. Well, actually, we found a whole byte, I should say. Then we can go look at the second to last byte, manipulate that until we get 2, 2, and then 3, 3, 3, and so forth. And we can keep doing this over and over again to decrypt the entire thing. So what we did here, we turned our decryptor into an oracle, basically something that tells us something about things we've given it. So in this case, it tells us, was the padding right? And by waiting for it to tell us that the padding is right over and over again, we can wind up decrypting the entire ciphertext. And this is known as the padding oracle attack. And you might have heard of this as Poodle, or padding oracle on downgraded legacy encryption. It was a big bug where if you could get a server to talk to a client from a really old version of SSL, SSL in general, you would be able to then execute this attack against it because it did nothing to prevent it. So this is happening because CBC is partially malleable. It means that given the ciphertext and only the ciphertext, I can predictably change the plaintext. Now, you notice I can't change all the plaintext however I want, because you notice that this bit is just totally trashed. But all we need is that last block to come out correctly, and we can start making inferences. So the solution to this is to add a kind of tamper seal, a thing that tells us, hey, this was messed with. And that's called message authentication. You might have heard that as a MAC, or message authentication code. It's basically just like a hash of the message that you encrypted, for example. And before you do anything else to the message, you check that. If you do anything before you verify the message is legitimate, you will certainly find doom. And there's a great article, which I'll be linking at the end, called the Cryptographic Doom Principle, which will tell you all about that. And from the other end, you can similarly kind of squeeze out secrets. Like, I want to find the IV here. Well, if I have a known plaintext ciphertext pair, I know that when I came out of this decryption step, this data must have been P1 XOR IV, because you XOR with IV again, you get P1. So I could make my own bogus block here. Just B is whatever I want. And what will happen is it'll decrypt. This will be total nonsense. We don't even know. We just made this ciphertext up. But the next block will decrypt to P1 XOR IV. And therefore, we can, XOR that with B. And what if I, say, made B equal P1? Well, IV falls out. So CVC just kind of sucks. It's actually pretty bad. I think it's still used, in a variety of places, but by itself, it is insecure and bad. So there's other modes that we can use instead, like the counter mode, which instead of using taking the ciphertext and combining it with the next decryption, we just take a counter. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth, and we encrypt that and XOR that with the data. So we never actually encrypt the data directly. We just compute the counter and XOR it with the plaintext or the ciphertext. And so that will actually give us a stream cipher. Because if we have too many bytes, we don't have enough bytes at the end, we can just throw out some of the key we made up. There's no requirements for a block anymore. And the Glory counter mode adds authentication on top of that. And it's a little complicated, but nothing wild. But basically, it's adding authentication and preventing the attacker from messing with our ciphertext. So I think the takeaway here is that crypto is absolutely terrifying, incredibly easy to mess up, and goes horribly wrong when it does. It's kind of easy to leak information. So we looked at Cipher blockchain mode can not only reveal the initialization vector, can also reveal the entire plaintext. Everything has been revealed, 100%. And one more slide. There we go. So it's really easy to make a mistake, and you have to be very careful when you're doing this. Kind of compared to steganography, where it was kind of just by the seat of our pants, doing whatever you wanted. Cryptography, there's a reason that the common saying is never roll your own crypto, and this is the reason. It's very kind of finicky. It does make it a great source of CTF challenges, however. So, some further reading on the subject. As I mentioned, the Cryptographic Doom Principle. Great little article talking about just two different ways, I believe, that just doing anything with your message before verifying its authenticity leads to total disaster. As well as Reasoning by Lego, the wrong way to think about cryptography. This little article, it talks about why you really have to make sure every part of your system is completely airtight. Because otherwise, one part of it will just kind of fall over and the whole thing breaks. And if you want to try some of the stuff out yourself, I highly recommend checking out CryptoPals. It's a website you can go to that, let's see if I can open it here actually. It's a big set of crypto challenges. It will teach you from absolute zero knowledge all sorts of cryptography. We talked about basics, block cryptography, got to step 3 or 4 here. And this stuff, like Diffie-Hellman, RSA, we'll be getting into next week. If you have a look through here, it's got a little basic challenge, starting with just taking some data and encoding it as text, and then all the little building blocks you need. I do with Python. It's a good language for it. There's some great libraries to kind of get you going. But people have done it in all sorts of languages. I can't wait to see it in TorqueScript. Let's bring ourselves up to full screen here. So next Monday, we're going to be doing a bit of a math primer to kind of get you up to speed to some of the stuff you'll need to kind of grasp what we do on Friday. We talk about asymmetric cryptography. We'll be doing things like talking about RSA, how does HTTPS work in the first place, and key exchange, because symmetric cryptography is great, but how do we share keys? The answer is asymmetric cryptography. So definitely come by and check that out next week, and in the meantime, I highly suggest joining us on our Slack. As long as you have an RPI email, you can join, and if you don't, send us an email on the RPI check our website. We have the details there. You can fire us an email. But yeah, that about wraps things up. If there aren't any questions, we'll be ending the stream in just a minute. Thanks for coming, everyone, and have a good evening.